Hello everyone, I am here and continuing with the topic of politics, that is historical background. And in the last class I discussed from 1773 to 1853, and today I will discuss from 1858 to 1909. So before that, I would like to ask one question to everyone: why we are studying historical background in polity? That means we can study historical background in the spectrum also, but why we are studying historical background in polity? For that, we have to understand that in 1773, this was what? Bombay, Madras, and this was what? Bengal. Now, Bombay had executive powers, legislative powers. Madras have executive powers, legislative powers. Bengal had executive powers, legislative powers. Now in 1773, few legislative powers of Bombay and Madras have been curtailed and added to what? Bengal. What I am saying, few legislative powers, I am using the words few legislative powers of Bombay and few legislative powers of Madras have been curtailed and added to what? Bengal, so that the governor of Bengal what become stronger than that of Bengal and what? Madras. That's why Governor of Bengal become what? Governor General of Bengal. Governor General of Bengal. So Governor of Bengal become what? Governor General of Bengal. Governor General of Bengal. In order to help or aid the Governor General of Bengal, there formed a executive council. An executive council was formed. An executive council was formed to aid the Governor General of Bengal, and this executive council had how many members? 4 members. These were having how many members? 4 members. Now these 4 members were basically what? Executive. These 4 members were basically what? Executive, but they were also performing the function of legislator. That means they were basically executive, but they were also performing the function of what? Legislators. Yes, I can take the example of Biru, the most destructive batsman of the planet, who can also what? Bowl. What I am saying, the most destructive batsman in the planet, who can also what? Bowl. He is in the team because of what? His batting capabilities, but he can also what? Bowl. And his bowling is also, do not underestimate, he was also a lethal bowler sometimes. Okay, so Biru primarily was a batsman who can also what? Bowl. Similarly, these 4 executive members, they were basically executive, but they are also doing the function of what? Legislator. Similarly, we can take the example of our Prime Minister Modi. We can take the example of Mr. Modi. Our Modi ji, our Modi, he is basically a what? A legislator. Our Modi, he is basically what? Legislator, but he is also performing the duty of what? Executive. Yes, what I am saying? Modi basically a legislator, but also performing the duty of what? Executive. So if we compare these two, what happened in 1773? These four members were executive, but they were performing the duty of what? Legislator. So here it was what? Executive supremacy. It was what? Executive supremacy. It was what? Executive supremacy. In 1773, we have observed what? There was a what? Executive supremacy. But in present context, we have what? Legislative supremacy. We have what? Legislative supremacy. Okay. So how this executive supremacy had been transformed into what? A legislative supremacy. That is what we are going to study in what? Historical background in polity. That is what we are going to study in the historical background of what? Polity. Okay, that's why we are studying what? Polity, historical background in polity. This how executive supremacy had been transformed into what? Legislative supremacy. Okay. Now, we also studied about what? We also studied about what? We also studied about what? 1853 Charter Act, and it was the what? Last Charter Act. 1853 Charter Act was what? Last Charter Act. Why it was last Charter Act? Because it was the last Charter Act because the East India Company, which had lost almost all the powers in the Act of what? 1853. Because there was what? Open examination for convenanted civil service. There was what? An open examination for convenanted civil service. Civil service was of two types. One was lower civil service, another was higher civil service. Higher civil services were said to be what? Convenanted civil services. So what happened? Earlier bureaucrators, they were what? Loyal to what? East India Company. Earlier, before 1853, what happened? Bureaucrators were loyal to what? East India Company. But after open examination for convenanted civil services, bureaucrators, they were not loyal to the East India Company. That means they were not what? Remaining as loyal as earlier. That's why the East India Company had lost almost all the powers in India. They were simply remain as what? They were simply remain as what? A trust under British government. They remain what? Simply a trust under British government. Okay. Now, who knows the destiny? Who knows the destiny? Who knows? The Britishers or East India Company, whatever they did in India was, everyone, we all know, because of their what? Harsh policy towards Indians. Because of their what? Harsh policies towards Indians, like that of doctrine of lapse, and one was what? Paramountcy, doctrine of paramountcy, and the most recent was, that means immediate cause was what? Use of grease curtides, in Enfield rifle. Okay, so because of their harsh policy like that of doctrine of lapse, doctrine of paramountcy, and use of grease curtides in the Enfield rifle, which used to be a immediate cause, and it results what? We have seen what? 1857 first war of independence. And this first war of independence, Britishers used to say what? Simply a what? Revolt, or they can say what? A sepoy mutiny, or they also say what? They also used to say what? Simply a rebel. But for Indian, we considered it as what? First war of what? Independence. And what is the effect or results? The results of what? 1857 first war of independence was end of rule of East India Company in India, and starting of British Raj in India, So this was the results of 1857 first war of independence, end of the rule of East India Company in India, and starting of British Raj in India. That means India were directly ruled under what? British Crown. India were directly ruled under what? British Crown. And when India come directly under British Crown, and the results, and they first passed one of the important act, to rule India, and that act was what? Government of India Act 1858. That act was what? Government of India Act 1858. And this was also said to be what? A good government for India. This was also said to be what? A good government for India. Okay, this was also said to be a good government for India. It was used according to British. What happened? Government of India Act 1858 was what? A good government for India. And what is the first in Government of India Act 1858? What they did? The Governor General was replaced by what? Was replaced by Viceroy. And the Viceroy was what? Direct representative of what? Viceroy was what? Direct representative of British Crown. Okay. And number two, what they did? 15 member in London, 15 members in London formed Council of India. 15 members in London formed Council of India, and these members or the Council of India was to be headed by what? Secretary of State. Earlier, before 1858, we have seen what? Board of Direct Control and Court of Director. The power possessed by both of them were taken away by what? Secretary of State. The power possessed by both Board of Control and Court of Director were taken by what? Secretary of State, and these two, Board of Control and Court of Director, was what? Abolished. It was what? Abolished. And this was what, this act was also said to be what, the government was also said to be what, a responsible government, a responsible government. This was said to be what, a responsible government. In 1858, in the month of November, the Queen of British, she had proclaimed that she would be the what? She would be the what? Empress of India. She would be what? Empress of India. In 1858, in the month of November, at Allahabad, the Queen of the British proclaimed herself as the what? Empress of India, and her government in India is said to be what? Her Majesty government. Her government in India was said to be what? Her Majesty government. And this government was what? A responsible government. Responsible government. What happened? Secretary of State was what? A cabinet minister. He was a what? A cabinet minister. He was a what? Cabinet minister of British Parliament. He was a cabinet minister of what? British Parliament. And therefore the Secretary of State was what? Answerable to what? British Parliament. Secretary of State was answerable to what? British Parliament. Secretary of State was answerable to what? British Parliament. And in India, all the offices will be answerable to what? Viceroy. In India, all the offices will be answerable to what? Viceroy. Viceroy will be answerable to what? Secretary of State. Secretary of State will be answerable to what? British Parliament. Secretary of State will be answerable to what? British Parliament. Thus it was what? A answerable government. Thus it was a what? A answerable government. Thus it was a what? Answerable government. An answerable government is said to be what? A responsible government. That's why, and a responsible government was said to be what? Good governance. So according to British Government of India Act in 1858 was what? A good government for India. How? Secretary of State, which was a what? Cabinet minister of British Parliament, he was answerable to what? British Parliament. And the Viceroy in India will be answerable to what? Secretary of State. And all the offices in India will be answerable to what? Viceroy. Thus it was a what? Answerable government. An answerable government is said to be what? Responsible government. And a responsible government is said to be what? Good governance for India. And one more thing had happened. What is that? This 15 member in London which form a Council of India. This Council of India also said to be what? Secretary of State Council. Secretary of State Council. This was empowered with a body corporate. This was empowered with what? A body corporate. And that means what? This body corporate means what? Now Indian can file case against Britishers, and Britishers also can file case against what? Indians. So this Secretary of State Council was empowered what? A body corporate. Body corporate means what? Indian can file complaint against them, and they also, Britishers also can file case against Indians. Okay, so this was what? Government of India Act 1858. Now, slowly and steadily, British had realized that the importance of inclusion of Indians. Now, before that, I would like to say that the Government of India Act of 1858 was just a what? Administrative streamlining. Was what is just a administrative streamlining. And it was not applied in the field. The acts of 1858 were looking good only in papers, no in the application in the field. Therefore, it was just considered as what? A administrative streamlining. Now, slowly and steadily, the British had realized the importance of inclusion of Indians into the what? Administrative machinery. So, for that, they had passed what? 3 Indian Council Act. Indian Council Act. First, it was passed in what? 1861, then 1892, then 1909. So, first, the basic motive was what? To involve more Indians, into what? Into legislative council. Now, first I will talk about what? Indian Council Act of 1861. First we will talk about what? Indian Council Act of what? 1861. So what? The then Viceroy, it was known as what? Lord Canning, for the first time in the history of British Raj, he nominated 3 Indians. He nominated 3 Indians into the what? Into the Central Legislative Council. And these members were what? Non-official members. These members were what? Non-official members, meaning they don't have mass powers. Okay, so they were what? Just non-official members. And those 3 members were what? Were what? Raja of Benares, Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. Okay, these 3 Indians were nominated by what? Lord Canning into the Central Legislative Council, and they were what? Non-official members. And number 2, what happened? Number 2 provision in this act was what? Starting of decentralization. Starting of what? Decentralization. So starting of decentralization was happened what? In the act of what? Indian Council Act of 1861. So starting of decentralization. What do you mean by that? For that, again, this was what? Bombay, Madras, and this was what? Bengal. In the year 1773, Bombay had executive powers, legislative powers. Madras had executive powers, legislative powers. Bengal had executive powers, legislative powers. Now in 1773, few of the legislative powers of Bombay and Madras have been curtailed, and these were added to what? Bengal. and this was the starting of what? Centralization. It was what? Starting of centralization. So 70-73 was what? Starting of centralization. Starting of centralization. Now in 1833, centralization reached at its what? Climax. Centralization reached at its what? Climax. That means centralization was at its what? Peak. That means in 1833, all the legislative powers of Bombay, all the legislative powers of Madras have been curtailed, and these were added to what? Bengal. These were added to what? Bengal. So this was what? Since all the legislative powers have been curtailed and added to Bengal, so this was what? Centralization at its peak, or centralization reached peaks in what? 1833. Now in 1861, what happened? Lord Canning decided to returning back. Lord Canning has decided to returning back the legislative powers. Lord Canning has decided to what? Returning back the legislative powers, and this was said to be what? Starting of what? Decentralization. The starting of decentralization was done by what? Lord Canning in the Indian Council Act of what? 1861. And the ending of decentralization was happened in what? 1937. 1937, all the legislative powers which have been taken away by the Bengal were returned, completely returning their complete returning of the what? All the legislative powers to the various provinces. It had happened in the year 1937. Complete returning of the what? Legislative powers to the various provinces. So that was what? In 1937 what? It was what? Complete decentralization. Complete decentralization had happened in the year what? 1937. Okay, so starting of decentralization was happened in the year 1861 under Indian Council Act. It was done by what? Lord Canning. And number third point, it is also one of the important point, that is what? Number third point is what? Portfolios. The portfolios in 1859 Lord Canning introduced it, but it was just what? A executive order. It was what? An executive order. This executive order have to convert into what? Acts. This executive order has to be transformed into what? Acts. And it was done acts. That means it has passed through what? Legislative sanctions, through legislative process. The executive order of 1859 about what? Introduction of what? Portfolios. Okay, about what? Portfolios was converted into acts by what? Indian Council Act. That means portfolios which had been introduced by Lord Canning in the year 1859, it was just executive order, and this executive order has been transformed into what? Acts by the Lord Canning in the year what? 1861 under Indian Council Act. And number 4 is what? Ordinance. Ordinance means what? What do you mean by ordinance? In the present context also, ordinance meaning is what? Same. Passing of laws by executive when parliament is not in session. Okay, passing of laws by executive when parliament is not in session, that is what? Ordinance. So today's ordinance is similar to what? Ordinance of 1861 under what? Indian Council Act, and this validity of ordinance is what? 6 months. Validity was 6 months. So these were the important provision in under Indian Council Act of 1861. Now, features of Act of 1892. The main motive behind Act of 1892 was to make stronger legislative council. How? Earlier nominated members were not having much powers. Now they were given power to discuss what? Budget. To discuss budget. The nominated members were given powers to discuss budgets and ask the questions to what? Executive. To executive. And besides this, what one major provision had happened in the Act of 1892, that is what you have to know. There are two types of legislative council. One was what? Central Legislative Council, and another was what? Provincial Legislative Council, Two council were there. Okay. Now, Viceroy had directly nominated the members for Central Legislative Council as well as what? Provincial Legislative Council. The nominated members were directly nominated by what? Viceroy. Now, in the Act of 1892, for nominating the members for Central Legislative Council, Viceroy had to take recommendation from what? Provincial Legislative Council and Bengal Chamber of Bengal Commerce. That means earlier the Viceroy directly nominated the members into what? Central Legislative Council. Now, in order to nominate the members for Central Legislative Council, the Viceroy had to take recommendation from what? Provincial Legislative Council as well as what? Chamber of Bengal Commerce. Again, the Viceroy, while nominating the members for Provincial Legislative Council, the Viceroy had to take recommendation from universities, zamindars, etc. Okay, that means earlier Viceroy directly nominated the members for Central Legislative Council and Provincial Legislative Council, but after the Act of 1892, Viceroy had to what? Take recommendation from Provincial Legislative Council and Chamber of Bengal Commerce in order to nominate the members into the Central Legislative Council. Similarly, Viceroy had to take recommendation from zamindars, universities, etc. in order to nominate the members into what? Provincial Legislative Council. Now these recommendations which were taken for nominating the members either in Central Legislative Council or in Provincial Legislative Council was assumed as what? An indirect election. This recommendation, the recommendation which have to taken from what? Provincial Legislative Council and Chamber of Bengal Commerce for nominating the members into the Central Legislative Council or to nominate the members into what provincial legislative council, the viceroy had to take recommendation from universities, zamindars, etc. So these recommendations were assumed to what? An indirect election. However, the election word was not written in anywhere. You will not get the word election anywhere, but these recommendations are assumed to be what? An indirect election. And what? Indirect election. So these were what? Major features of Act of what? 1892. Now, the features of Act of 1909. The background behind was what? The background behind was what? Formation of Muslim League. Formation of Muslim League in 1906 and division of Bengal in 1905 by Lord Curzon. So these are the background behind the what? Act of 1909. And this act is also said to be what? Morley-Minto reforms. Morley was what? Secretary of State, and Minto was what? Was the then Viceroy. He was the Viceroy and Morley was what? Secretary of State. And one sudden changes happens that members of Central Legislative Councils increases from 16 to what? 60. At the same way, the provincial members of Provincial Legislative Council had also increases, but it was what? Variable. Both members of Central Legislative Council increases and members of Provincial Legislative Council also increases, but it was varied from provinces to provinces. At the same time, in the history of Indians, in the history of what? British Raj, what had happened? Satyendra Prasad Sinha was nominated by what? Viceroy to what? His executive council. For the first time in the history of British Raj, S.P. Sinha was the first Indians to be nominated for the Viceroy's Executive Council, and he was the law member. He was law member. He was what? Law member. Okay. And Lord Minto is known as what? Father of communalism, because what? Separate electorate for the Muslim. In 1909, separate electorate for Muslim has been given. That's why Lord Minto is said to be what? Father of communalism. And one more thing I have forgotten to tell you, the features of 1892. That we have seen some reforms in 1892. It was because that in 1885 formation of Congress, and this after the formation of Congress they have put lots of pressure to the British. That's why we have seen some reforms in 1892.